Right, welcome back, everybody. Let's get into some population growth. That's what we'll be talking about today. About the exams, overall, very good scores. I have a few questions I'm going to look at to see if maybe some adjustments could be made. So anyway, just take note of that the grade will change, or may change, I should say. And I think that would mostly go up for most people. Okay, so I hope to have that done later today or tomorrow. So we are jumping now. We'll be jumping into Nicholas Christakis' book on coronavirus soon. We'll be wrapping up Connected and the coming neo-feudalism as we proceed. And I'll also be lecturing on more topical issues. So, sorry, my nose is really runny. So a couple of things. First of all, thank you for a number of you for your well wishes for me. I'm doing much better than I was. It turns out I didn't break my hand, so that's good. But yeah, it's going to be a while before I go back to boxing all the time, or ever. Okay, so thank you for that. Other things, yeah, so COVID, we'll just kind of see where things go. It is affecting every aspect of global society. So, that's why I chose a book about it, because it is the big thing that is, restructuring economies, country relations, the medical industry, and so on, schools, and so on. So I think it'll be good to explore that in a sociological way. Now, okay. Other good news about things. Today, this morning, I got my vaccine, my first dose. Maybe why I'm so stuffy. They get you sick a little bit. But other than that, I don't feel anything. Okay. So we're talking about population growth today, as we then move into talking about urban sociology and the environment. So we know that there are many countries around the world that have large populations, but not a lot of resources and not a lot of money to take care of all these people. Excuse me. Do that off camera now. Okay. So if starving children in these poor countries are fed, won't the population growth rate generally go up? That's kind of the main answer. If you got a country that seems to have a high population and you don't have enough resources for them, how would helping those starving kids lower the population growth rate? That seems very counterintuitive, which it is, and that's one of those things about social science. You find all these sort of counterintuitive things all the time, and they're kind of fun. Okay, so this is kind of what's the basic attitude that some of these people must die in order to keep us from overpopulating the planet. Okay, and so you get some of the first, or kind of the, where should I go? I'll go here. Okay, so you get some of the first analyses of population growth and its impact on society in the early 1970s. Book Famine 1975 was predicting, mass starvation by the mid-70s. The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich was sort of predicting the same thing. Basically, by the year 2000, the world would be in complete, utter decline, and so on. Interestingly, in about 1980 or so, Paul Ehrlich, a Stanford biologist who I had the pleasure of meeting one time. Anyway, back in about 1980, he had made a bet with this economist about the price of 5 metals. The economist's name is Julian Simon, and they made a bet of which way the prices would go over the next decade. And so they kind of, picked like tungsten, copper, I'm forgetting what else, and Paul Ehrlich, the biologist, said, well, according to basic supply and demand, the prices will go up. We're having this huge exponential population growth happening. And so it just seems likely that the population or the prices, would go up as people needed more copper for telephone lines and all sorts of things. Okay, and so Julian Simon, the economist, said, no, people will be able to innovate and figure out more efficient ways of using these metals. So, and they bet like $2,000 or $4,000 or something. So, fairly real money. And by the end of the decade, Julian Simon, the economist, ended up getting the $2,000 or whatever it was, and Ehrlich had to, pay out and so forth. So the prices actually did drop for those metals, and it's because people, companies, governments were becoming more efficient in the way that they use those metals. So I like to tell that story because I think it's really important. That doesn't hold true for all resources. So there's been, a lot of resources where, I guess like crops and stuff, it doesn't hold true for. So anyway, it's not like we can't innovate ourselves out of every problem, so to speak. But I think it's a very important way to think about this. And if you're interested, his book is called The Ultimate Resource, which is basically, our ingenuity. I used to be really fascinated into this stuff. So Paul Ehrlich, as I said, he was wrong about a number of things, but he was one of the first people to look at or try to think systematically about these things. And so we have IPAT here. IPAT was this famous sort of equation in early environmental studies, the impact of the Earth caused by, the size of the human race, level of wealth, affluence, consumption, that sort of thing. And then technology, population, affluence, technology. Well, there's some problems with this model. First of all, it's based on averages. And as we learned in, I'm thinking about my other class. As we will learn in future classes, there are hugely disproportionate impacts that people have. Okay, so the IPAT model, though, treats big and small consumers as if they're the same. So they might treat someone in a poor village in Bangladesh the same way they treat a rich person in China or the United States. And that's problematic because it does not really give an accurate, a good picture of actual resource use. Okay. The other thing that's problematic is that it's really hard to measure technology, whether technology is doing good or bad. And it's, technology itself is fairly neutral. Rather, how is it that we use it? Sometimes there's, it's clear that technology is causing the problems, or certain technologies, I should say. Sometimes they help fix these problems. Interesting article about oil companies and the post-oil period, might transition to being companies that clean up the environment or something. Maybe that's just sort of like wishful thinking. Okay. Excuse me. Okay. All right. So you may have heard this guy's name before. Maybe you've heard of the phrase Malthusian crisis. This refers to basically when a country does not have enough resources, food in particular, to sustain the growing population. So Malthus was the first economist to look at the population. He worked for the British East India Company, which kind of terrorized large parts of the world, especially India. And so Malthus, he has these sayings, that nature has its own way to cut population, crime, disease, war, and so on. And then that last line, I'll talk about that later. So the modern Malthus, I would say, I'll go over here. Garrett Hardin. He was a biologist at University of California, Santa Barbara, where I got my PhD. My wife worked in the environmental studies department that he was in, although he had died before we moved out there. But anyway, he had kind of a looming presence in the environmental studies department there. So he writes this article in 1968 called Tragedy of the Commons. And by some estimates, it's one of the most read articles in history. Hardin himself is fairly controversial. You can read what's on the slide on your own time. I won't go into that. But basically, his theory was that if you allow people to just hold, let me go back here to just look at him for a second. So if you allow people to hold resources in common, basically you have a common area, that people are going to just act selfishly to, overuse what they're allocated, that sort of thing. And so first thing we have to understand about Hardin is he is operating within the rational choice model of the human mind and human behavior. He's thinking that, if there's some, river there, that, it's almost inevitable that people are going to drain it of all the fish because, that's just what happens. That's the tragedy of the commons. And in the article, he has this famous metaphor where you have this pasture, this field that's held in common by a number of cattle herders. And each of them are allowed a specific number. We'll just say 1 for simplicity. So each person has 1 cow on the field. And one person says, I could make a lot more money or have more milk or whatever if I had another cow. So they add another cow. Others see that happening and they say, hey, maybe I'll add 2 cows too. I'll add 3. And pretty soon you get this happening and the land is overgrazed and degraded. This is sort of a pictorial representation. You got the first commons here, but then everybody's got their cows and so on. Okay, so Hardin said that if he were to rewrite the article, he would have changed the title to The Tragedy of the Unregulated Commons. So he thought there needs to be some sort of regulation from up on high. It was basically, he said, capitalism or socialism might work, but you have to have somebody that's managing the use of resources. So the slides in there sort of out of nowhere. You can look at these slides on your own, just kind of basic demographic data for some countries. I'm going to talk about Elinor Ostrom. So Elinor Ostrom, I don't know if it was her life goal to prove Hardin wrong, but she certainly did on many occasions. So Elinor Ostrom is sort of kind of a personal hero of mine, just because of her intellectual breadth and the expansive research that she did. So she was interested in resources, in the tragedy of the commons, essentially. So she and her colleagues did a lot of studies of all different types of organizations, such as tribes in all parts of the world, various municipalities in Southern California and how they manage water use, police forces, how they manage their uses, their resources, given, they have certain limitations and, there's a lot of crime happening, especially at the time that she was doing that research. And so her findings were that, that it's not always a government or a corporation or someone up on high that makes the best decisions. Sometimes it can be people on the bottom level. Sometimes markets work best. Sometimes it's, self-government. Sometimes it's actual government regulation. So her whole point is the world is complicated and, one model is probably not going to capture, all of our resource use. Her famous book, I should also mention, she won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2012, and she was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Economics for this work. So her kind of famous work was Governing the Commons, the Evolution of Institutions for Collective Action. If you're interested in this type of thing, you might look in, want to read that one. But like a lot of scholars and academics, people like us, we don't just write our own things. If we're good academics, we try to impart this knowledge to other people and get them on board as well. So in addition to all the studies that she was doing, she was also editing a lot of these volumes of other studies that were kind of taking her ideas and then applying them around the world. So you see all these studies on different types of institutions. So, oh yeah, another thing that I think is really cool that they would do that was really, people who studied resource use weren't really doing at that time was game theory, which is like it sounds. It's decision theories, but maybe it should be called instead of game theory. But basically, they would have people in the lab playing games, and they would, it would be some game that would, measure their, how they would manage resources, that sort of thing. So they had all this research out in the field, ethnographies, a lot of ethnographic research happening out there. And then they also had a lot of lab experiments like you would see in social psychology or general psychology. Anyway, I think she's a pretty cool person. I'm not going to go through all of these, but they're on the slide if you're interested in the modules. She kind of distills the 8 things that seems to help make the commons work. So, as I said, she's more or less proven the basic Hardin theory incorrect, that, the world is just, again, Hardin was operating in that rational choice theory model. Eleanor Ostrom is operating in a more intellectually diverse world, or paying attention to different strands of research. That's why she's kind of a personal hero of mine. Okay, so the other thing we talk about proportionality when we talk about the environment. One of the things that I'll be stressing is disproportionality, that some people have a way bigger impact than others. A couple of my colleagues at UC Santa Barbara, where I was at for about eight or 9 years, my wife worked in that program too. These researchers, Park and Pello, went to look at Aspen, Colorado. Aspen is a large resort town. It's where a lot of wealthy, famous people go to ski lodges and that sort of thing. It's like up in the mountains in Colorado. And so they did this research where they went and they interviewed people there, and they were asking, what's the biggest cause of environmental problems in this area? And you would have people who lived in large mansions. I don't know if they interviewed anyone who lived in this specific one, but, people who are living in these, enormous homes. And they were basically saying, well, the biggest problem are the Hispanic and Latinx immigrants, or, people who are the workers. And they're not all immigrants. Some of them have been citizens for, generations or whatever. And some of them are recently immigrated. So that really kind of fascinated them. They sort of looked into that, and a lot of those workers didn't actually live in Aspen. They lived outside in small towns and had to commute into Aspen. And they were living in trailers and low budget motels that were not, didn't even come close to the ecological footprint that you see like a big Marriott hotel or some of these gigantic mansions. Some of the eco footprints they leave are much, much bigger than these workers. We'll talk about this more when we talk about the environment. Okay, so I asked, how do we know that saving children helps population growth rates go down? First of all, we know that fertility rates can be brought down. That's kind of the first step you want to do. And this happens usually through increased access to public health for children, nutrition, that sort of thing, and the education of women, which I don't have on the slide, but should be there because that's really key. Urbanization is a big part of it. Fertility and economic development is being combined. So when we talk about population growth, we're talking about measurable growth in 2 forms, arithmetic and exponential. Arithmetic operates by the principles of simple addition. So say you have like 7 units going up an arithmetic curve. It's doing it by single units. So by the 7th unit, you're at the number 7. If you're doing the same thing, but it's doubling each time, each new unit you go to, you start out with 1, but because of the doubling, by the time you reach the seventh unit, you're at 64 because it's doubling. And so that's why we've probably heard about this quite a bit in relation to to coronavirus. So, coronavirus has been on, various exponential curves throughout the last year globally, and especially in parts of the United States. People who don't understand exponential growth, which was a lot of people, I don't think they could fathom the way in which the numbers would increase. So anyway, exponential growth, very, very key term to understand. So when we talk about another sort of way of kind of thinking about exponential growth. There's this legend in math classes around the world that a king offered a reward to the inventor of chess. He said, no money or no gold, just what do you want me to give you? But none of that. And the inventor says, how about you give me 1 grain of wheat or rice on the first square, 2 on the second, 4 on the third, and then, just doubling it for all the squares on the board. And the king didn't know anything about exponential growth, so he said, oh, sure, that's going to be nothing. This will be a small amount. Well, he was wrong. It was 18.5 quintillion grains, and this imaginary king was beheaded, and a new regime took over that took exponential growth seriously. Okay, so you can see it starts at 1, 2, 4, up to 128 on the first row, doubles to 256. Although by the end of the second row, you're at almost 33,000, then 64,000, etc., 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 till you get to this square at the end, and that is 18.5 quintillion grains, as I said. If you want to look at it in chart form, arithmetic growth curve, geometric, exponential. What I want to point out, say this is time down here on the x-axis. You see that throughout most of the chart, the red arithmetic growth, is far above the exponential growth. But once the doubling really kicks in with larger numbers, then it overtakes the arithmetic curve by quite a bit. So, as I said, in addition to coronavirus, exponential growth is important to understand. The human population, and coronavirus. Can't remember which one I said. Okay. So one thing I do want to point out in this that I think is fascinating is that it took all of human history to reach the first 1 billion people. And then, about 100 years for the second, 30 years for the third, and then just about every 13 years or so, we had another billion people. I think this does a good job of showing it too. You can see, just the shortening of years. Although you start to see a lengthening too, and that's as we come to this slide. This explains why you start to see the estimates, looking like it takes longer to add another billion. So one of the most important terms in this lecture, and perhaps this class, is total fertility rate. It measures the average number of children born per woman during her reproductive years. So you can see in Canada, Europe, and parts of Asia that the total fertility rate is less than 2, meaning most women are having 2 or less children. Then you see the yellow, that means 2 to 3 children. And you can see that's the United States, much of Latin America, parts of Central Asia, and elsewhere. So that's 2 to 3. And you might wonder, why is America not like Canada or Europe or some of the East Asian countries that are wealthy, Australia, etc.? A lot of it has to do with immigration. So when immigrants move into... This basically happens around the world. Immigrants usually have larger families than the host country that they're immigrating to. So since the United States has a more open immigration policy than a lot of countries in Europe and Asia, you see that its population growth rate I mean, not population. Yeah, it's total fertility rate is higher. I mean, lower. Sorry, is lower than you would see in Europe and other wealthier countries. We'll see what happens with coronavirus and with immigration changes instituted by the Trump administration. How if that affects things. As I said, we'll kind of see how that goes. But basically, you have rural societies starting out with high fertility, lots of child death that gets offset by high mortality, little food, poor health, and so on. And then you get a drop in the mortality rates as sanitation gets better, and then fertility rates start to decrease, and the population generally stabilizes. One thing I want to point out here. You see that sub-Saharan Africa has 5 or more children. You've got other parts of the world that have 3 or more. These are places where you have big population problems happening. But I think it's important and instructive to know that if we would have taken this map and looked at it 100 years ago, everywhere would have been red. Everywhere women were having 5 or more children. It was really the advancements in medicine and food and transportation and sanitation and so on that led to this. It's really it's astounding from a demographic perspective. What it means for the future is difficult to tell, but sort of where we're at. Okay, I do want to play a video by a statistician named Hans Rosling. So I talk about him for a moment before I play it. So he died a couple of years ago, but he's a famous Swedish statistician, and he's famous for using these bubbles that represent countries of various population size. Sometimes he uses them in like a hologram in front of him, and it's very high tech, very cool. But he's also done some things like he swallowed a sword on on stage or something to sort of make his point, gave a lecture like submerged in water. Very interesting guy. So anyway, I want to play this video where he describes this basic process, but instead of using his these digital bubbles or holograms or anything like that, he uses boxes from IKEA, the furniture place. But it's very effective, I think. So I'll play that and then I'll return to the lecture. Okay, going to the start.
I still remember the day in school when our teacher told us that the world population had become 3 billion people. And that was in 1960. And I'm going to talk now of how world population has changed from that year and into the future. But I will not use digital technology as I've done during my first 5 TED Talks. Instead, I have progressed, and I am today launching a brand new analog teaching technology that I picked up from IKEA. This box contains 1 billion people. And our teacher told us that the industrialized world, 1960, had 1 billion people. And the developing world, she said, they had 2 billion people. And they lived away then. There was a big gap between the 1 billion in the industrialized world and the 2 billion in the developing world. The industrialized world, people were healthy, educated, rich, and they had small families. And their aspiration was to buy a car. And in 1960, all Swedes were saving to try to buy a Volvo like this. This was the economic level at which Sweden was. But in contrast to this, the developing world, far away, the aspiration of the average family there was to have food for the day. And they were saving to be able to buy a pair of shoes. There was an enormous gap in the world when I grew up. And this gap between the West and the rest has created a mindset of the world which we still use linguistically when we talk about the West and the developing world. But the world has changed, and it's overdue to upgrade that mindset and that taxonomy of the world and to understand it. And that's what I'm going to show you. Because since 1960, what has happened in the world up to 2010 is that a staggering 4 billion people have been added to the world population. Just look how many. The world population has doubled since I went to school. And of course there has been economic growth in the West. A lot of companies have happened to grow the economy, so the Western population moved over to here. And now their aspiration is not only to have a car, now they want to have a holiday on a very remote destination, and they want to fly. So this is where they are today. And the most successful of the developing countries here, they have moved on, you know, and they have become emerging economies, we call them. And they are now buying cars. And what happened a month ago was that the Chinese company Geely, they acquired the Volvo company. And then finally the Swedes understood that something big had happened in the world. You know? So there they are. And the tragedy is that the 2 billion over here that is struggling for food and shoes, they are still almost as poor as they were 50 years ago. The new thing is that we have the biggest pile of billions, the 3 billions here, which are also becoming emerging economies. Because they are quite healthy, relatively well educated, and they already also have 2 to 3 children per woman, as those have. And their aspiration now is, of course, to buy a bicycle. And then later on they would like to have a motorbike also. But this is the world we have today. No longer any gap. But the distance from the poorest here, the very poorest, to the very richest over here, is wider than ever. But there is a continuous world from walking, biking, driving, flying. There are people on all levels, and most people tend to be somewhere in the middle. This is the new world we have today in 2010. And what will happen in the future? Well, I'm going to project into 2050. I was in Shanghai recently, and I listened to what's happening in China, and it's pretty sure that they will catch up, just as Japan did. All the projections. This one will grow with 1 to 2 or 3%, and this grows with 7, 8, and then they will land up here. They will start flying. And these lower middle income countries, the emerging countries, they will also forge forwards economically. And if, but only if, we invest in the right green technology so that we can avoid severe climate change and energy can still be relatively cheap, then they will move all the way up here. And they will start to buy electric cars. Isn't it? This is what we will find there. So what about the poorest 2 billion? What about the poorest 2 billion here? Will they move on? Well, here population comes in, because there we already have 2 to 3 children per woman. Family planning is widely used, and population growth is coming to an end. Here population is growing. So these 2 billions will in the next decades increase to 3 billions, and they will thereafter increase to 4 billion. There is nothing but the nuclear war of a kind we've never seen that can stop this from happening. Because we already have this in process. But if, and only if, they get out of poverty, they get education, they get improved child survival, they can buy a bicycle and a cell phone and come here, then population growth will stop up there in 2050. We cannot have people on this level looking for food and shoes, because then we get continued population growth. And let me show you why, by converting back to the old-time digital technology. Here I have on the screen my country bubbles. Every bubble is a country, the size is population, the colors show the continent, the yellow one there is the Americas, dark blue is Africa, brown is Europe, green is Middle East, And this light blue is South Asia, that's India, and this is China, size is population. Here I have children per woman. 2 children, 4 children, 6 children, 8 children. Big families, small families. The year is 1960, and down here, child survival. The percentage of children surviving childhood up to starting school. 60%, 70%, 80%, 90%, and almost 100%, as we have today in the wealthiest and healthiest countries. Look, this is the world my teacher talked about in 1960. 1 billion Western world here, high child survival, small families, and all the rest, the rainbow of the developing countries with very large families and poor child survival. What has happened? I start the world. Here we go. Can you see, as the year passed by, child survival is increasing. They get soap, hygiene, education, vaccination, penicillin, and then family planning. Family size is decreasing. They get up to 90% of child survival. Then family is decreasing. Also, the Arab countries in the Middle East is falling down there. Look, Bangladesh catching up with India. The whole emerging economy world joins the Western world with good child survival and small family size, but we still have the poorest billion. Can you see the poorest billion? Those boxes I had over here? They are still up here, and they still have a child survival of 70 to 80%, meaning that if you have 6 children born, there will be at least 4 who survive to the next generation, and the population will double in 1 generation. So the only way of really getting world population to stop is to continue to improve child survival to 90%. That's why investments by Gates Foundation, UNICEF and aid organization, together with national government in the poorest countries, are so good. Because they are actually helping us to reach a sustainable population size of the world. We can stop at 9 billion if we do the right things. Child survival is the new green. It's only by child surviving that we will stop population growth. And will it happen? Well, I'm not an optimist. Neither am I a pessimist. I'm a very serious possibilist. It's a new category where we take emotion apart and we just work analytically with the world. It can be done. We can have a much more just world with green technology and with investments to alleviate poverty and global governance. The world can become like this. And look at the position of the Old West. Remember when this blue box was all alone, leading the world, living its own life? This will not happen. The role of the Old West in the New World is to become the foundation of the modern world. Nothing more, nothing less. But it's a very important role. Do it well and get used to it. Thank you very much.
Stop this. Okay, everyone. Get back to it. All right. Go past this. Do want to show some of these population charts here. This is what kind of you would find in most wealthier countries where you've got most of the population in the Middle Ages. Not a lot of children, if you remember, and more elderly people than other places. Okay, so poor countries. This is what poor countries look like. They have large families, so lots of children. And it's basically a pyramid because, as you get older, people are less likely to keep living and so on. So yes, this is, if we want to look at some real examples, you can look at the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which classic population pyramid there. The United States, you've got this bulge here of the baby boomers, and then negative growth in Germany, basically meaning they can't sustain the replacement rate. The replacement rate is a term that refers to when workers retire or die or leave the workforce, essentially, that there's a younger person, worker, immigrant, whatever, that takes their place, so to speak, within the broader economy. And it also, a lot of Western countries rely upon rely upon this for helping helping elderly, basically social programs like Social Security, and so on. So again, this is a challenge that many countries will face because they'll have fewer young people and they'll have more old people. As I shall show, here's Japan if you're interested, kind of the same dynamics there. Another thing too, the other reason why we see population growth is not only because there are, more or less kids being it's not just because the population increased over the last 200 years and more people were having more children or something like that. Also, life expectancy went way up. As you can see here, life expectancy was not about 35 throughout most of history till you really get into the 1800s and it really starts to jump up there to getting up to around 80 for the United States. It was getting to around, I believe, 70 something and went down for a few years, went down a few years. So anyways, again, something to think about. I think it's pretty amazing that most of humans throughout history never made it to my age, which is just under 40 somewhere. So anyway, yeah, I think it's very interesting to me that we've had these societies throughout time where 35 is pretty old. People would ask 40-year-olds, like, impart your wisdom to us, old one. Okay, are you ready for retirement? Have you been saving for retirement? Okay, so anyway, because it's coming, and one of the things that is very fascinating is what societies are going to look like mid-century. So if we look at the average age in the year 2000, it was Japan with an average age of 41. You see Italy there, and so on and so forth. Then you've got, they're sort of projecting to 2050 based on current trend. Spain will have the oldest population with an average age of 55. Basically, you get a lot of countries in the 50s. Japan, Italy, even China is almost at 52. So I have to, stress this because it's so important. There has never in the history of the world been a society where the average age is in the 50s. So this is going to be something that's totally new. It is going to be a very gray society in places that are rich. I mean, it's the richer world where you see longer lives. Why isn't the United States on here? And what's its projection? It's projected to be in the mid 40s or so. Again, mostly based on immigration. But again, if that were to change in coronavirus, who knows? But based on trends before COVID, this is where it seems to be going. And I don't see anything in COVID that's going to change that so dramatically. All right, the baby boomers. Some of you may have heard this term. Some of you may not know what it is. So baby boomers refer to this period of high births between 1946 and 1964, when 79 million people were added to the population. Basically, World War II, all the men went to fight. They came back in 1945, got busy with their wives. That's the technical way in which scholars talk about it. And out of it came the baby boom, and you had this huge explosion of kids. And as I'll talk about with urban sociology, it happened at a time when America was kind of expanding itself. So we have had 3 baby boomer presidents: Donald Trump, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton. Came close to having 4 with Hillary Clinton. I have to say something about the photo here of the Clintons. When Bill Clinton first ran for president in 1992, he was famously asked if he had ever smoked marijuana. Now, marijuana is this plant that you can smoke and get high from, as some of you probably know all too well. So anyway, someone asked him if he had ever smoked marijuana. And he said, yes, but I didn't inhale. And inhaling is you can't really use it without inhaling. So, everybody laughed at that and, thought that was such a squirmy way out of that question. But if you look here, it looks like Hillary's eyes, if you look at Hillary's eyes right here, it looks like she maybe inhaled right before this picture was taken. I was always kind of waiting for it to come out, the next Clinton scandal. Okay, so are you going to make enough money, do you think, to help take care of your aging parents when you become, adults in the work or in the world of work and so on? I'm sort of entering this now, and it's challenging for sure. Again, so just where we're at, where we're going, 2035, about 15 years from now, the baby boomers will, the youngest ones will be in their 70s, the oldest ones getting to about 90 or so. And there will still, even in 2060, be a few baby boomers in their hundreds who will still know, like Rolling Stone songs or something like that, when everyone else has forgotten it. Okay, what about America? What's happening with us? The next generation, I think one good way to think about it is the sandwich generation. You can read the text on your own. The sandwich generation refers to people basically increasingly between, I would say, 35 and 60, 65, people that are trying to take care of their aging parents or take care of their kids. Now there's the actual people doing that care, but then as a society, we kind of do this through taxation and other things where we pay for the Social Security for the elderly and pay for schooling and so on for the kids. And so we call this the sandwich generation, these generation that has to, kind of take care of the young and the old. So I hope you have a better understanding of population growth. So the tragedy of the commons, is mostly wrong, except when we talk about maritime fishing, as I'll describe. But the idea that we need to learn how to better manage our resources and our waste, while at the same time having to take care of our mothers and daughters or whatever, is going to be a challenge, no doubt about it. So, anyway, I think this population lecture should give you a good broad view of what's going on, like the big picture sort of thing. Then that will be good, especially as we start talking about urbanization and the environment. All right, everyone, have a good day.